Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and colleagues, today on King's Holiday, we pause a moment to honor the legacy and the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. This past Saturday, January the 17th, Dr. King would have turned 93 years old had his life had not ended abruptly 54 years ago at the age of 39. There are so many things that we remember about Dr. King. Generations have been told, some lived during the period, but I think all of us remember a certain portion of Dr. King's speech, "I Have a Dream." And that "I Have a Dream" that everyone remembers, it talks about that little children will one day, he hoped, would one day live in a nation where they would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. But many ignore the rest of the speech. It was about more than just treating people the same regardless of color. It was also about redressing inequity in our nation and making the reality of our nation match the promise of its founding principles and the fierce urgency of now to do so. He also warned us of dangerous repercussions of doing nothing. Dr. King, Mr. Speaker, dedicated his life, and he sacrificed his life to the issue of equity, equality, and justice for all. Dr. King framed his speech in the historic context. 1 century after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which served as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. Yet 100 years after the hope and the promise of that document, Black Americans still had not achieved full freedom and equality, but instead, as Dr. King said, was sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination, living on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity, languishing in the corners of American society on an exile in his own land. Today, we still struggle and fight for those rights, the rights that often leave us, and I guess others, wondering, why are they asking this? Why are they fighting for this? Why are they continuing raising this issue? And it is because we have not reached those dreams, not economically, not in the criminal justice system, not in the educational system, and not in health care. And even as we look at what we're dealing with today, I'm reminded of all of these things that Dr. King has said, because I've looked at just on Saturday and what I've read in the newspaper and on yesterday, how issues of importance, issues that we should be willing to stand up and support and address, how we want to dismiss those various things. Issues like critical race theory and an executive order to ban something that does not exist in the state of Virginia. We have to continue to struggle and fight. Fight for freedom and fight for justice and fight for equity. To put a finer point on it, King declared that there was the march that they had in 1963. It was a march to cash a check. He reminded us that when the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men and women, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The march was to call out America for defaulting on this promissory note. Let me put Dr. King's speech into the broader context, historical context. the very conception of our nation over 400 years ago. The dates and events may be taught in our public education system, but not their significance in shaping who we are as a society, both in 1963 and today. 1607 is the year we learned that the England's first permanent colony was established at Jamestown along the James River. The rest of the story is that the settlement was a part of a business venture, the Virginia Company of London, to explore the land and discover how best to exploit its natural resources for commercial profit. And about 100 white men, Englishmen, established Jamestown on a land that was already occupied. Within the past 5 years, we have seen a resurgence of backlash to the gains made by African Americans, women, and other historically marginalized groups. This is slowly brewed, culminating in the election of Barack Obama and especially the election of Donald Trump, sparking reemergence of explicit white supremacists as seen in the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017 and the January 6th insurrection. We saw it in the response to generational changes made in the wake of George Floyd's murder, again surfacing a call to ban critical race theory, a coordinated campaign to intimidate teachers, school board members, and prevent teachers from teaching a complete, accurate history of our nation. In other words, teaching the truth. So I would say, Mr. Speaker and colleagues, yet now is not the time to hide from our history. Now is not a time to retreat. It is the right time to teach generations about truth and consequences. I have never seen a time like this before that I can remember, where there's such a disregard for truth. Where are we and who are we as a nation and a commonwealth? Now is the time for the rededication of oneself to something greater than you and I, and that is to be purposeful in standing on principles such as Dr. King did, standing there on principles that include respecting one another. My parents always talked about principles. Be kind to others, Dolores. Be respectful to others. Let your word be your bond. Keep your promise. A good name is better than riches. Always protect your good name. But one that stuck with me more than anything that my parents taught me, to always tell the truth. Be humble, but tell the truth. And I hear these words as a constant ring in my ear. This one, tell the truth. Even if it hurts, know the truth, because it sets you free. And along with many others that we have an opportunity to pass on to generations. So Dr. King was a man guided by a system that served the very essence of who he was and what he wanted for America. Those principles would elevate him to be one of the most targeted men in America, and sometimes the most hated. When he was gunned down, assassinated on the balcony of Lorraine Hotel on April the 4th, 1968, Dr. King's public disapproval rate was nearly 75% at that time. But he knew that he was fighting a battle that was visible and hidden. But his limited time on earth, 39 years, produced tangible lessons and profound messages for a lifetime. And those messages still ring, yes, in 2022 for each of us. All of which should encourage us to rededicate ourselves to build a beloved community. Dr. King repeatedly envisioned, as John Lewis would say, democracy is not a state, it is an act. And each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community, a nation and a world society at peace with itself. So 50 years later, we still seek to redeem the promissory note of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution for all Americans and make the dream a reality. Mr. Speaker and colleagues, today is the day. It starts with me and it starts with you, making this dream a reality and shifting our priorities to achieve the beloved community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.